January 20th, 1953 dawned cold and gray over Washington, a chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the capital city. On this morning, as crowds gathered along Pennsylvania Avenue to witness the peaceful transfer of power, two men sat in separate rooms, preparing for a ritual that would become anything but peaceful. Inside the White House, President Harry S. Truman dressed quietly, his jaw set with the same stubborn determination that had carried him through 7 years of impossible decisions. Just blocks away, at the Statler Hotel, President-elect Dwight David Eisenhower fastened his tie with military precision, his face a mask of controlled fury that few outside his inner circle would recognize. The relationship between these two men had not always been poisoned. Indeed, there was a time when Truman had considered Eisenhower not just an ally, but a potential successor of his own choosing. In 1945, when the general returned from Europe crowned with victory laurels, Truman had whispered to him at a reception that he would gladly help Eisenhower win the presidency, even running as his vice president if necessary. But that was before the political machinery ground their friendship to dust, before ambition and ideology drove a wedge so deep that on this inauguration morning, Eisenhower made a decision that would shock the nation. He would refuse to enter Truman's White House. The tradition was sacrosanct. Every incoming president since the earliest days of the Republic had begun Inauguration Day by calling upon his predecessor, at the executive mansion, sharing coffee or tea and riding together to the Capitol in a symbolic gesture of democratic continuity. But Eisenhower's limousine pulled up to the North Portico at precisely 11 o'clock that morning, and the general remained firmly seated in the back seat, his face turned away from the White House doors. Secret Service agents shifted uncomfortably. Aides exchanged worried glances. Inside, Truman waited, then understood, then flushed with an anger he would carry to his grave. According to contemporary accounts documented by historian David McCullough, whose extensive research into Truman's presidency provides crucial insight into this moment, the outgoing president finally emerged onto the portico alone, his expression thunderous. He descended the steps stiffly, climbed into the limousine beside Eisenhower, and the two men sat in glacial silence as the car rolled toward Capitol Hill. The crowds lining the route sensed something terribly wrong, their cheers faltering as they glimpsed the rigid profiles of both men staring straight ahead, never once acknowledging each other. What had brought them to this moment of profound public rupture? The answer lay not in a single incident but in a cascade of perceived betrayals, political calculations, and deeply personal wounds that had accumulated over the previous 2 years. The campaign of 1952 had been particularly vicious, with Eisenhower's refusal to defend former Secretary of State George Marshall Truman's close friend and Eisenhower's former commander from Senator Joseph McCarthy's reckless accusations serving as perhaps the most unforgivable sin in Truman's eyes. But even deeper currents ran beneath the surface, currents of class resentment, military versus civilian authority, and the fundamental question of what it meant to be an American leader in the atomic age. The limousine carried them through streets lined with Americans who had no idea they were witnessing history of an entirely different sort than they had anticipated. To understand how two men who had once shared mutual respect could descend into such bitter animosity, one must travel back to 1945. When the world still smoldered from the fires of the Second World War, General Dwight Eisenhower strode through the streets of European capitals as a conquering hero, the architect of Nazi Germany's defeat, while Harry Truman, thrust suddenly into the presidency by Franklin Roosevelt's death, struggled to fill shoes that seemed impossibly large. Their first meeting as president and general had been cordial, even warm, with Truman deeply impressed by Eisenhower's modesty and apparent lack of political ambition. Truman, who had never attended college and had failed at business before entering politics, found himself drawn to Eisenhower's apparent everyman quality despite his extraordinary achievements. The president saw in the general a rare combination: military brilliance without the dangerous political hunger that had toppled democracies throughout history. At a June 1945 victory celebration, Truman had made his extraordinary offer, telling Eisenhower he would support him for president in 1948 and even serve as his running mate. Eisenhower had demurred, insisting he had no political aspirations whatsoever, that he was a soldier who wished only to return to a quiet life once his service ended. For several years, this dynamic held steady. Eisenhower served as Army Chief of Staff, then accepted the presidency of Columbia University in 1948, seeming to confirm his disinterest in electoral politics. Meanwhile, Truman shocked the political establishment by winning the presidency in his own right that same year, defeating Thomas Dewey in what remains one of American history's greatest upsets. The president and the general maintained a friendly correspondence, exchanging letters on military policy and international affairs, with Truman continuing to seek Eisenhower's counsel on matters of national defense. The Korean War, which erupted in June 1950, began to shift the tectonic plates beneath their relationship. Truman's decision to commit American forces to defend South Korea proved deeply unpopular as the conflict dragged on, with casualties mounting and no clear victory in sight. The president's dismissal of General Douglas MacArthur in April 1951, though supported by military leadership including Eisenhower, unleashed a firestorm of public criticism. Truman's approval ratings plummeted to levels rarely seen in American presidential history, hovering near 23% by early 1952. Republican Party leaders, sensing opportunity, began courting Eisenhower with increasing intensity. The general, now serving as Supreme Commander of NATO forces in Europe, maintained his public stance of political neutrality, but private conversations revealed a growing concern about what he viewed as excessive government spending and creeping socialism under democratic administrations. Letters from these years, preserved in the Eisenhower Presidential Library, show a man wrestling with duty to country versus personal preference, increasingly convinced that only his candidacy could prevent what he saw as fiscal catastrophe and weak foreign policy. The moment of transformation came in 1952, when Eisenhower finally declared his Republican affiliation and entered the presidential race. Truman felt betrayed on multiple levels. Not only had Eisenhower broken what Truman considered an implicit promise to stay out of politics, but he had joined the opposition party, the party of men Truman viewed as isolationists, who had opposed the very international engagement Eisenhower himself had championed. The personal became political, and the political became deeply personal in ways that would prove impossible to untangle. But nothing cut Truman deeper than Eisenhower's treatment of George Catlett Marshall, the man both president and general revered above all other living Americans. Marshall had served as Army Chief of Staff during World War II, as Secretary of State who developed the plan that saved post-war Europe, and as Secretary of Defense during the Korean War's darkest hours. He was, in Truman's estimation, the greatest American of the 20th century. Eisenhower owed his European command and subsequent fame directly to Marshall's selection and support. Yet Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, riding high on his anti-communist crusade, had branded Marshall a traitor, part of a conspiracy so immense and an infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. The moment of truth came in October 1952, when Eisenhower's campaign train rolled through Wisconsin, McCarthy's home state. The general's speechwriters had prepared remarks defending Marshall against McCarthy's slanders, paragraphs that praised Marshall's character and patriotism. As documented in journalist Evan Thomas's biography of Eisenhower, the general reviewed these passages aboard his campaign train, approved them, and prepared to deliver them at a major rally in Milwaukee. But McCarthy himself boarded the train, met with Eisenhower privately, and when the general took the podium that evening, the Marshall defense had been deleted entirely. Eisenhower stood beside McCarthy, smiling for cameras, the two men's hands clasped in apparent unity. Truman, watching newsreels of that rally, felt something break inside him. He had disagreed with Eisenhower's politics, resented his candidacy, and bristled at campaign attacks, but this was different. This was cowardice, a betrayal not just of Marshall but of the values Truman believed military men like Eisenhower were supposed to embody. The president began attacking Eisenhower personally in his own campaign speeches, supporting Democratic nominee Adlai Stevenson with unusual venom for an outgoing president. He called Eisenhower's military record into question, suggesting that others deserved more credit for winning the war. He mocked Eisenhower's intellect, claiming the general was being manipulated by cynical Republican operatives. He questioned Eisenhower's courage, the ultimate insult from one who had served in combat to one whose military reputation was unassailable. Eisenhower's response was equally personal. He stopped referring to Truman as President Truman or the President, using only Truman or the administration, with a disdain that dripped from every syllable. He blamed Truman personally for every American casualty in Korea, implying that the president's incompetence was killing American boys. He suggested that corruption in Truman's administration reached into the Oval Office itself, though carefully avoiding explicit accusations that might invite libel suits. The two men, who had once corresponded as friends, now communicated only through increasingly bitter public statements. The election itself was a landslide, with Eisenhower capturing 42 of 48 states and winning the popular vote by nearly 7 million ballots. Truman watched the returns come in at his home in Independence, Missouri, surrounded by loyalists but feeling utterly rejected by the American people he had served through crisis after crisis. The next morning, duty required that he telegraph congratulations to President-elect Eisenhower and begin the transition process. But every word of courtesy cost him dearly. The first face-to-face meeting came on November 5th, just 2 days after the election, when protocol demanded that Eisenhower visit the White House for an initial transition discussion. Truman, determined to maintain presidential dignity despite his personal feelings, prepared thoroughly for the meeting, assembling briefing books on everything from ongoing military operations to sensitive intelligence matters. He arranged for key cabinet officials and military leaders to be available for consultations. He even ordered the White House kitchen to prepare Eisenhower's favorite foods, a gesture of hospitality that cost him considerable pride given his bitter feelings. Eisenhower arrived exactly on time, his military punctuality in full evidence, but his demeanor was arctic. According to accounts preserved in the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library, the meeting lasted barely 2 hours, far shorter than traditional transition consultations. The president-elect showed minimal interest in the detailed briefings Truman's staff had prepared, asking few questions and volunteering almost nothing about his own plans or policy intentions. When Truman tried to engage him in substantive discussions about Korea, Soviet intentions, or domestic policy challenges, Eisenhower responded with platitudes or simply deferred, saying his team would handle such matters after the inauguration. One exchange particularly galled Truman. The president explained the reasoning behind several controversial decisions: the firing of MacArthur, the decision to fight in Korea, the approach to negotiations with the Soviets, seeking not approval but at least understanding from his successor. Eisenhower listened impassively, then responded that he preferred to make his own judgments without being influenced by the previous administration's thinking. Truman, veteran of countless tough negotiations, recognized the response for what it was: a deliberate insult, suggesting that nothing the current administration had done or learned was worth considering. The president's face flushed, but he maintained his composure, curtly ending the meeting earlier than scheduled. Subsequent interactions grew even more strained. When Truman invited Eisenhower to attend National Security Council meetings during the transition to understand ongoing operations and decision-making processes, the president-elect declined, sending representatives instead. When Truman offered to arrange detailed briefings on the most sensitive intelligence matters, including atomic weapons capabilities, covert operations, and assessments of Soviet leadership, Eisenhower agreed only to minimal briefings, preferring to receive information through his own incoming team rather than from Truman's people. The message was clear: the incoming administration viewed the outgoing one as not just wrong on policy, but as fundamentally tainted, its information and advice suspect by association. The Eisenhower team's behavior toward Truman's staff proved even more dismissive. Incoming officials treated their outgoing counterparts with a coldness that violated every tradition of professional courtesy in government service. Requests for information were met with delays or outright refusals. Attempts to explain ongoing programs and policies were cut short or ignored entirely. Career civil servants found themselves caught in the middle, unsure whether to respond to requests from the incoming team that seemed designed to circumvent or undermine the outgoing president's authority. The atmosphere grew so toxic that several senior Truman advisors complained directly to the president, asking permission to refuse cooperation altogether, though Truman insisted they maintain professional standards even if Eisenhower's people would not. Behind closed doors, Truman raged. He understood political differences and expected partisan attacks, but this wholesale rejection of institutional continuity struck him as dangerous to national security and contemptuous of the presidency itself. In private conversations recorded by his staff, Truman used language about Eisenhower that would have shocked Americans who knew him only through his public persona. He questioned Eisenhower's intelligence, his character, and his fitness for office, predictions that the general would prove a disaster as president, manipulated by smarter men with dangerous ideologies. Of all the grievances that accumulated between Truman and Eisenhower during the campaign and transition, none cut deeper or proved more irreparable than the matter of George Marshall. To understand the intensity of Truman's fury required understanding what Marshall meant to him, not just as a public figure, but as a personal ideal, the embodiment of everything Truman believed a great American should be. Marshall had shown Truman, a man without college education or elite credentials, the same respect he showed everyone, judging by character and competence rather than pedigree. When Truman had faced the impossible decision about using atomic weapons against Japan, Marshall had offered clear military counsel without political. War, Marshall had answered the call despite being past normal retirement age and in declining health. More than this, Marshall had discovered and promoted Eisenhower when he was merely a competent staff officer unknown to the public, seeing in him qualities that others missed and giving him the European command that made him a household name. Marshall had protected Eisenhower from political enemies during the war, defended his decisions when operations went badly, and ensured he received credit when they went well. Without Marshall, there would have been no General Eisenhower as the world knew him, no Supreme Commander, no President-elect. This made Eisenhower's failure to defend Marshall from McCarthy's attacks not just politically cowardly but personally disgraceful in Truman's eyes. Senator McCarthy's specific charges against Marshall revealed the depths of the anti-communist hysteria gripping portions of American politics in the early 1950s. McCarthy had claimed that Marshall was part of a communist conspiracy, that his China policy had deliberately lost that country to Mao Zedong's forces, that his European recovery program was designed to strengthen socialist governments, and that his counsel during the war had served Soviet rather than American interests. These accusations were not merely wrong but grotesquely absurd to anyone who knew Marshall's record, yet they resonated with Americans frightened by Soviet atomic weapons, communist expansion, and the Korean stalemate. Eisenhower's deletion of Marshall's defense from his Milwaukee speech, as documented by multiple journalists traveling with his campaign, had not been a spontaneous decision but a calculated political choice. His advisors had argued that defending Marshall would alienate Wisconsin voters whose support was crucial, that McCarthy's popularity there was too strong to challenge directly, and that Eisenhower could not afford to lose any Republican votes in what was then considered a potentially close election. From a purely tactical standpoint, the advice made sense. From a moral standpoint, at least in Truman's judgment, it represented a fundamental failure of character, choosing political advantage over loyalty to the man who had made Eisenhower's career possible. Truman had tried to raise the Marshall issue during their November transition meeting, asking Eisenhower directly how he could have remained silent while McCarthy slandered a man they both knew to be a patriot beyond question. According to notes taken by White House staff, Eisenhower had responded that he disagreed with McCarthy's assessment of Marshall but saw no point in creating a public fight that would only elevate McCarthy's profile and divide the Republican Party. He argued that quiet disagreement was more effective than public confrontation, that his silence was strategic rather than cowardly. Truman had exploded at this response, his Missouri temper breaking through his presidential reserve, calling Eisenhower's explanation hogwash and accusing him of putting party loyalty above honor. The argument had nearly ended the meeting entirely, with both men standing, faces flushed, voices raised beyond what Secret Service agents in adjacent rooms could help but overhear. Eisenhower had drawn himself to full military bearing, responding icily that he would not accept lectures on honor from someone whose administration had been riddled with corruption and whose foreign policy had enabled communist expansion worldwide. Truman had fired back that whatever mistakes his administration had made, at least he had never betrayed the man who had given him everything. Only the intervention of staff members, physically stepping between the two men, had prevented the complete collapse of even minimal civility. The Marshall issue crystallized everything else that divided them. For Truman, it proved that Eisenhower lacked the moral courage essential to presidential leadership, that his famous smile concealed a weakness of character that would make him easy prey for demagogues and extremists. For Eisenhower, Truman's self-righteous indignation over the Marshall matter was typical of a man who refused to acknowledge that politics sometimes required unpleasant compromises, that governing meant making hard choices between imperfect options, and that Truman's own record was hardly spotless enough to justify such sanctimony. Neither man could see the other's perspective because neither trusted the other's motives, each convinced the other was not just wrong but fundamentally flawed as a leader and as a man. As Inauguration Day approached, the question of ceremony and protocol took on outsized importance, every detail freighted with symbolic meaning in the context of such profound personal animosity. The Presidential Inaugural Committee, composed of members from both administrations, struggled to navigate between tradition and tension, trying to arrange an inauguration that would project democratic continuity to the nation and world while accommodating two men who could barely stand to be in the same room. The committee's challenge was complicated by Eisenhower's team, which seemed determined to minimize any suggestion that Eisenhower owed anything to his predecessor, or that the outgoing administration deserved any acknowledgement beyond the minimum required by custom. The traditional schedule called for the president-elect to arrive at the White House on inauguration morning, where he would be greeted by the outgoing president. The two men would then share coffee or tea in the Blue Room, joined by their wives and perhaps a few close advisors in an intimate moment symbolizing the peaceful transfer of power. Following this, they would ride together in an open car from the White House to the Capitol, waving to crowds lining Pennsylvania Avenue, before the president-elect took his oath and the former president retreated into private life. This ritual, performed with variations since the earliest days of the Republic, represented one of democracy's most powerful images, political opponents setting aside their differences to honor something larger than themselves. Eisenhower's staff, however, began proposing alterations to the traditional schedule. They suggested that perhaps the two men might meet instead at a neutral location, or that the president-elect might proceed directly to the Capitol. They questioned whether the coffee ritual was truly necessary, whether the joint car ride might be shortened, whether photographs of the two men together might be limited. Truman's staff, recognizing these suggestions as deliberate attempts to minimize Eisenhower's association with the outgoing administration, pushed back, insisting that tradition be honored regardless of personal feelings. The committee found itself mediating increasingly bitter disputes over what should have been routine ceremonial matters. In early January 1953, Truman made what he considered a gracious gesture, one that cost him considerable pride, but which he felt duty required. He sent a personal letter to Eisenhower, handwritten rather than typed, acknowledging their differences but expressing hope that they might at least perform the inauguration rituals with dignity. He reminded Eisenhower that the ceremony was not about them personally but about the office and the nation, that Americans in the watching world needed to see that democracy's transitions could be managed peacefully, even between men who disagreed profoundly. He suggested that they both had an obligation to rise above their personal feelings for the sake of something larger than themselves. Eisenhower's response, which arrived more than a week later and was typed on official stationery rather than handwritten, was coldly formal. He agreed that the inauguration should be conducted properly, but made no acknowledgment of Truman's personal gesture or appeal. Instead, he focused on logistical details, suggesting that the coffee meeting be shortened to 15 minutes and that photographers be limited in their access. Most pointedly, he instructed his staff to inform Truman's team that Mrs. Mamie Eisenhower would not be accompanying her husband to the White House on inauguration morning due to her need to prepare for the inaugural balls that evening. This was a transparent fiction first ladies had always managed to do both, and everyone understood it as a deliberate snub of Mrs. Bess Truman. The slight to his wife pushed Truman past any remaining inclination toward graciousness. Bess Truman had endured years of unfair criticism and invasion of privacy, had supported her husband through impossible decisions and political attacks, and had maintained her dignity throughout. That Eisenhower would use his wife to deliver an insult struck Truman as not just personally offensive but ungentlemanly, a violation of codes of conduct that transcended political disagreement. In a meeting with his closest advisers, Truman declared that if Eisenhower wanted to treat the inauguration as a hostile encounter rather than a democratic ritual, then so be it. The president would fulfill his constitutional duties but would not pretend warmth where none existed. The final week before inauguration saw both camps hardening their positions. Eisenhower's staff made clear that the president-elect would participate in the ceremony but would not engage in any unnecessary interaction with Truman beyond what protocol absolutely required. Truman's staff, taking their cue from their boss's anger, stopped attempting to coordinate beyond the bare minimum. The inaugural committee found itself unable to resolve even simple questions because neither side would compromise on anything. Washington insiders began whispering that the inauguration might turn into a public disaster, that the obvious hostility between outgoing and incoming presidents might embarrass the nation before the world. January 20th, 1953 arrived with temperatures hovering just above freezing, heavy clouds threatening rain or perhaps snow, and a tension in Washington's air that had nothing to do with weather. At the Statler Hotel, Dwight Eisenhower woke early, as was his military habit, and went through his morning routine with characteristic precision. He read the morning newspapers over breakfast, noting that several columnists had picked up rumors of bad blood between him and Truman, but none yet understood just how bad the situation had become. He dressed in formal morning clothes, though he had privately complained that such civilian pomp felt absurd for a soldier. His aides briefed him on the day's schedule, and when they reached the White House portion, Eisenhower asked a question that froze the room. "Is there any way to skip that part entirely?" His chief of staff, Sherman Adams, a former New Hampshire governor known for his own flinty personality, responded carefully that tradition and public expectation made it impossible to simply bypass the White House stop entirely. However, Adams suggested perhaps the time spent inside could be minimized. Perhaps instead of going inside for coffee, the president-elect might simply wait in the car while someone went to fetch President Truman. Eisenhower seized on this idea immediately. He would fulfill the technical requirement of calling on the outgoing president without having to enter what he had taken to calling Truman's house in private conversations. It was a compromise between duty and distaste, a way to honor the office if not the man. At the White House, Truman had his own morning routine, though his mood was considerably darker. He had slept poorly, his mind churning through the accumulated grievances of recent months. He dressed with particular care, knowing that photographs from this day would last forever, and sat for a final breakfast as president in the family dining room. His staff had prepared detailed schedules for the day, timing calculated to the minute, but everyone moved quietly, sensing the president's foul temper. When someone mentioned that perhaps the day might prove less awkward than feared, that perhaps both men would rise to the occasion, Truman cut him off sharply. "Don't kid yourself. That man has shown me exactly who he is." The presidential limousine, a massive custom-built vehicle, designed to project both power and security, pulled up to the north portico at precisely 11 o'clock, as scheduled. Secret Service agents took their positions, photographers readied their cameras, and a small group of White House staff assembled to witness the departure. Inside the vehicle sat Eisenhower, alone, staring straight ahead. Minutes ticked by. Photographers began glancing at each other uncertainly. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Where was Eisenhower? Why hadn't he gotten out of the car? Inside the White House, staff members rushed to inform Truman that the president-elect had arrived but remained in the limousine. The president's face flushed crimson. For a long moment he stood absolutely still, and those who knew him well recognized this as the moment when his temper reached its most dangerous point, not the explosion but the cold fury that preceded it. "He won't come inside?" Truman asked quietly. The aide confirmed. "Then I suppose," Truman said, biting off each word, "I shall have to go to him." The president turned and walked toward the door, his stride stiff with barely contained rage. The scene that unfolded next was captured by photographers whose images would appear in newspapers worldwide, though none of the photos could convey the emotional weight of the moment. Truman emerged from the White House and descended the steps alone, no Eisenhower there to greet him as tradition dictated. The outgoing president's face was a mask of controlled fury, his jaw clenched, his eyes hard. He reached the limousine, and a Secret Service agent opened the door. Truman climbed in beside Eisenhower without a word. The door closed with a heavy thunk, sealing both men inside. What occurred during that limousine ride from the White House to the Capitol, a journey of less than 2 miles that took nearly 25 minutes through crowd-lined streets, remains partly mysterious because both men spoke of it differently afterward, and no one else was inside the passenger compartment to provide an objective account. What is certain, documented by the Secret Service agents in the follow car and visible to some spectators who stood close to the slow-moving vehicle, is that the two men sat as far apart as the seat allowed, both staring rigidly forward, neither speaking to or acknowledging the other. The smiles and waves that inaugural crowds expected were entirely absent. Eisenhower kept his face turned away from Truman's side of the car, while Truman stared straight ahead with an expression that one reporter later described as carved from granite. According to Truman's later accounts, preserved in his memoirs and in oral histories given to researchers, there was one brief exchange during the ride. As the limousine passed the Washington Monument, Truman, determined not to sit in complete silence for the entire journey, made a comment about the crowds and the ceremonies ahead. Eisenhower, Truman claimed, responded with a grunt or perhaps a monosyllable, then pointedly turned his attention to the window on his side of the car. Truman said nothing more. Eisenhower's version of the ride, by contrast, suggested that Truman had made several attempts at conversation that Eisenhower politely but firmly declined to engage, considering them inappropriate given the circumstances. The limousine finally reached the Capitol's East Plaza, where temporary platforms had been erected for the ceremony and where thousands of spectators stood in the January cold waiting to witness the oath-taking. Both men exited the vehicle separately, moving toward their designated positions without coordination or consultation. They stood near each other during the ceremony, but might as well have been on different continents for all the interaction between them. When Chief Justice Fred Vinson administered the oath and Eisenhower became the 34th President of the United States, Truman sat stone-faced, applauding only because protocol demanded it. Immediately following Eisenhower's inaugural address, Truman and Bess departed for Union Station to catch a train home to Missouri, skipping the traditional inaugural luncheon where outgoing and incoming presidents typically shared one final meal. The relationship between Truman and Eisenhower never recovered from that bitter inauguration day. In the years that followed, both men spoke of each other with continuing resentment in private, though both generally maintained public silence. Truman, in retirement in Independence, Missouri, would sit with visitors and researchers, and when asked about Eisenhower would shake his head with disgust. He called Eisenhower's presidency a disaster, blamed him for timidity in confronting McCarthy and segregationists, and never forgave the Marshall betrayal. In conversations recorded by biographer Merle Miller for the book Plain Speaking, published after Truman's death, the former president used language about Eisenhower that the researchers initially felt was too harsh to publish, calling him everything from a coward to a man who doesn't know the meaning of loyalty. Eisenhower, for his part, rarely spoke of Truman publicly during his 8 years as president, maintaining a careful distance from his predecessor. But in private correspondence and diaries, which scholars have since examined at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, the former general expressed continuing bitterness about Truman's attacks during the 1952 campaign. He believed Truman had tried to damage his reputation not from policy disagreements but from personal spite at being rejected by the voters. He viewed Truman as a small-time politician who had been promoted beyond his abilities by Roosevelt's death, someone who had bungled Korea and allowed corruption to flourish. The Inauguration Day insult, as Truman called it, Eisenhower viewed as no insult at all but simply a refusal to engage in false pleasantries with someone he neither liked nor respected. The broader historical significance of their rupture extended beyond personal drama. Their Inauguration Day confrontation marked perhaps the nadir of presidential transitions in American history, a cautionary tale about what happens when political polarization and personal animosity overwhelm institutional norms. Future presidents would look back on that cold January morning as an example of how not to conduct a transition, regardless of policy disagreements or campaign bitterness. The peaceful transfer of power depends not just on constitutional mechanics, but on a willingness by participants to place democratic ritual above personal feelings, something both Truman and Eisenhower failed to do on that day.